Okay, so thanks for the invitation. I've been here quite actually a number of times in the past, so it's always a great pleasure, especially considering that when I left Lansing was the temperature was in the 30s, and arrived in the 80s. It was a little bit of a hardship in terms of packing my clothes. Okay, so the title of this talk is a mathematical study of authorship attribution, and I was told that this Friday afternoon there will be some kind of liquids involved afterwards. People go out, and so shouldn't be too technical and it's geared toward undergraduates. So I will avoid as much mathematics as possible. Okay, so at least as many mathematical formulas as possible. So in the end, I really want to introduce a problem and get you to think about this kind of thing from a more mathematical point of view, but in a more general sense. Okay, so let's go. So roughly about last year in the summertime, this question actually surfaced up, and many of you probably already know the question. So the question was, who actually wrote this book called Cuckoo's College? And the author was a first-time author named Robert Galbraith. The book was very much received very favorable reviews from critics. But one of the lingering doubts was, well, this didn't look like someone who wrote a book, who was writing a book for the first time, because it was just too polished. And Robert Galbraith, in his biography, he claimed he was a veteran, served in the British military police in Afghanistan or Iraq, I forgot exactly. So he wrote this book, and it was the protagonist in that book is a retired military police who actually lost one of his legs, and so had to was discharged from the service and started his own private detective business. So anyway, the book was very well received by the critics. It didn't really have a lot of, it didn't sell that many copies. Okay, so it was okay. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't bad. But here's something. So I actually went to Amazon.com and was looking at this, the review, and the #1 review on Amazon was by this woman named Karen. This book is so well written, I suspect it's down the road will be a pseudonym for somebody else. Okay? And it actually had like 1,000 comments after this one. And the reason it has so many comments was actually there was a rumor saying this book was actually written by none other than J.K. Rowling. Okay? So suddenly there was a huge interest. Of course, there were denials and so anyway, so to get to the bottom of it, it actually the rumor appeared on a Twitter message, and the Twitter message was quickly deleted. It was only like 10 minutes before it was deleted. And to get to the bottom of it, actually the Sunday Times actually sent samples of books by these 4 authors and asked 2 experts who are known to have done some work in literary authorship investigation to see which one of these 4 do they believe fit, is close to the style of Cuckoo's College. Okay? So actually interesting, all 4 authors are mysteries or crime fiction writer, and all 4 of them are women. So they sent one of them, the person being sent to was this very well-known guy named Patrick Joala. And after running through their algorithms, Joala actually came back to the to Sunday Times and said, well, I really, basically it's hard to tell, but if you have to tell me that these, this Robert Galbraith is one of them, then I would say it is it's J.K. Rowling. Okay? is closest to Jacob. The other person couldn't tell. He requested more samples from these 4 authors, so he was given another book, and eventually he reached the same conclusion. So after a bunch of pressure from various sources, finally J.K. Rowling admitted actually he was Robert Galbraith. And so now this mystery is completely solved. Okay. But I want to I want to actually look into this problem, but by showing you how mathematics can be used. Actually, I actually had a student performing the same analysis. We actually got a much stronger sort of conclusion than what they seem to be able to indicate using different methods, even though they're still pretty conventional methods. And I will also talk about some other controversies. For instance, did Bill Ayers actually wrote Obama's biography, autobiography, Dreams from My Father? Or did Harper Lee actually write To Kill a Mockingbird? So I'll give you a couple of case studies, and one of the case studies is very well known in the Chinese literature. So I'll get to that. But first, let me just give you a little bit of background on the storytelling. Okay? And the term, so now you will see the term, every time they talk about literary forensics, they talk about the term stellometry. Okay? So this is the word. So this was, stellometry was a term coined in 1897 by this philosopher, Dostoevsky. And it was just a catch-all phrase for all kinds of quantitative analysis of literary art. Okay? So it's a general term. So now, if you follow the work of literary, they call literary forensics, you will hear the word being used quite often. Okay? Now, it's different from the traditional literary analysis because the traditional analysis relies most heavily on common sources. Okay? So you understand Shakespeare, then you make you see Shakespeare writes this way, and you have certain way of defining Shakespeare by you view as his style, not in a quantitative way, just sort of your connoisseurship, you understand his background, and then given a piece of work, and you say, I think this is not written by Shakespeare. Okay. But actually, even though the term itself is coined in 1897, it actually goes way back, okay? At least as far as we know, to the English mathematician Augustus de Morgan, and most of you should know de Morgan from the De Morgan's law. Okay? So it's the notes that actually we can trace back to was this letter he wrote, de Morgan wrote to his priest. I think it was the Reverend P, his name. It was in 1860 something, 67. Okay. So basically, at the time, I'm not a biblical scholar. So at the time, there was at least there were controversies about certain passages in the New Testament, whether the people questioned that these were actually written by Paul. And so De Morgan got into this, and he wrote this letter to Reverend E. He said, it has always run in my head that a little expenditure of money would settle questions of authorship in this way. So essentially, he was asking for a small grant from the local church. I think this was actually the first mathematical grant proposal recorded. Okay? So his idea was he was going to tabulate the average number of letters in a word for comparison to see whether that the paragraphs in question are sort of suspicious. And as it turned out, De Morgan was completely wrong. The average number of letters in a word is a terrible indicator of. It was completely useless, in fact, as a stellometric indicator for any kind of authorship analysis. And it was really only after the advent of large-scale computation, or the computers, computing power we have, that the literary spellometry has seen impressive developments. Okay? So I'm listing a bunch of, a few areas that are sort of currently pretty hot in some way. Maybe not entirely known to all the mathematicians, but when I was talking to just a few weeks ago, I was talking to some people in English department at MSU. They were talking about doing something called computational rhetoric. Okay? So these involve analyzing the moods and the text to show whether somebody's hedging and that sort of thing. And it's related to something called sentiment analysis. You can take all the newspaper articles and comments and you try to gauge the sentiment of the community, and maybe that would have some implication for stock market, for instance. Okay? Now there's a very well-known work on, essentially you can use Twitter messages to forecast epidemics, the flu epidemic. In fact, they were able to do this much earlier than CDC, like 5 days ahead of CDC. And Google has something similar. And I'll also talk a little bit about the spellometry for visual arts. So we have spellometry for literary art, but to analyze paintings, you can ask the same question, whether this particular painting was done by Van Gogh or Jackson Pollock. Okay. And these other things, and of course, we have heard about government surveillance. It's in the news all the time today. In fact, just as an example, thanks to Snowden's revelation, we know now there are a lot of government surveillance, and this is an example. Just whatever you do, just don't Google pressure cooker and backpack at the same time. Because if you do, the feds are going to come to your house, basically. Okay? So, and this was actually a true news item. Okay? Many of you probably already heard about this. So I want to do some, give you a little bit of some well-known case studies in the past of spellometry analysis, but versus connoisseurship. Okay? Connoisseurships is actually very, very important. So I already talked about the Ku Klux Klan investigation, which I did not get into detail, but it was clearly a triumph of literary spellometry analysis in some way, okay? And a little bit leak, sort of data leak, and a little bit gossip. Okay? There was so I do want to talk a little bit about this particular case of Don Foster. He is an English professor in Vassar College. So he became very famous because at one time there was a book named The Primary Color. How many of you actually heard about this book? Yeah. So the primary color was basically it was a book about the Clinton campaign. Clearly did not paint a very flattering image of the campaign. And it was written by somebody signed as anonymous. But everybody knew that it had to be somebody who was in the inner circle of Clinton campaign. But there were a lot of guessing game who was who was the person who wrote it. So this guy Don Foster, he actually figured out that it was somebody named somebody named Joe Klein, and of course he ousted him. He outed him, I should say. And but Don Joe Klein denied. He denied repeatedly on television, nationally broadcast television, said he wasn't the author. But after Don Foster's analysis, and there are other people coming to the same conclusion, some connoisseurs, and he finally acknowledged, yeah, he was a guy. Okay. So, so Don Foster became very famous for this. He was the, after that, he was sort of the reigning connoisseur of text analysis. So he was getting all kinds of tasks to, people asked him to help out identify the author of certain unknown, including the famous now anthrax case. So many of you probably remember the certain congressmen and senators were getting these letters that contain anthrax. And of course, they didn't have to open those. It was opened by the, by the aides or maybe by some postal workers. It turned out a few postal workers died. No senator actually got hurt. Kind of unfortunate. Nobody ever got hurt. But on every one of these letters, there was these mail letters. There was actually a letter saying, some message, accompanied this letter. So the FBI wanted to know, whether well, first of all, they narrowed down the search to people who had access to anthrax, and that was not a big group. So they were able to, they narrowed down. They believed they should narrow down to certain labs. Okay? And so they brought in Don Foster to analyze this. They also got, writings from the employees there. And Don Foster, spent some time, and he finally declared that he has a suspect, or he had a suspect. So the guy's name was McCormick. And there was no hard evidence against McCormick, except, Foster say, his style matches the style of the letter, basically. So the FBI put on some kind of 24-hour surveillance on this guy, and they couldn't get, they couldn't find anything, but they were convinced it was McCormick, so they put a lot of pressure. In fact, they started to harass him to the point that he had to quit his job. In fact, he may be forced to quit his job. And then he actually found a job, I think, in Singapore, and FBI went to Singapore and said, you should never hire this guy because he's a terrorist. So they fired him. And it got him that he had absolutely no way of getting any job. And so he, eventually he committed suicide. And he left a note saying he was completely innocent. That shook things up a little bit. And Don Foster actually, later he actually said, yeah, maybe the evidence against this guy wasn't as strong as I thought. So, so they had to, so eventually they decided he was actually innocent. So they had a new suspect, this guy named Stephen Hatfield. And this was the topic of a very long article on the Atlantic called The Wrong Man. So apparently they did exactly the same thing to Stephen Hatfield. And he was, basically he was on the verge of committing suicide. And somehow he didn't do it. And then the FBI dropped the case. They said, well, maybe, we were wrong. And, so it didn't work out well. I mean, in this case, the connoisseurship did not work out well. Okay, I want to, maybe I'll just do one example. This Jackson Pollock painting. So we all know Jackson Pollock. He had this so-called drip paintings. Essentially, you just take a canvas and drip paints onto the canvas. And he had, because it was so easy to do. I mean, everybody could do it. You could take a few cans of paint and just drip them, and hopefully you would create a few Jackson Pollocks of your own. Okay? So his paintings were very much imitated by lots of people. Okay? But somehow, it was very hard to seem to be getting the kind of painting he was getting. And they just didn't look at it most of the time. So, so there was there was a physicist in Oregon State University. His name is Richard Taylor. began to analyze Jackson Pollock using mathematics. In fact, he was using something called fractal geometry to analyze Jackson Pollock. He treated him as a fractal. He was devising these measurements that are related to fractal geometry, like Hausdorff dimension, entropy, that sort of thing. So in the end, he came up away with 8 criteria. And he claimed that he has seen many fakes, and all Jackson Pollock paintings passes through these 8 criteria. But none of the non-Jackson Pollock does, okay, from his experience. His work appeared in Nature, in Scientific American, and was very popular, very well known. Of course, he never actually put his quantitative analysis into real use until, well, a few years ago. I don't have this book. So suddenly this Alex Matter, someone named Alex Matter, found in his estate, I think it was like a warehouse in Long Island, his family owned, a cache of 30-some artwork by Jackson Pollock. I think it was 23 of them were drip paintings. And that, remember, one Jackson Pollock is selling for like $100 million. At least $40, $50 million. So this is, the stakes are very, very high. If it's a fake Jackson Pollock, it will sell maybe 20 bucks. Okay? But so the Lee Kressner, the widow of Jackson Pollock, actually commissioned Richard Taylor to apply his fractal method to tell people whether these 23 drip paintings were by Jackson Pollock or not, okay? Because the stake was so high. So Richard Taylor never shied from spotlight. So after he took over this project, he scanned the images and he called for a press conference. Then during the press conference, he announced that all 23 paintings were fake. Okay, so that's $100 million a piece to maybe $25 million a piece. Okay? And that did not go well with the estate, and they were very upset about this. At the same time, Taylor, his methodology and his mathematics was under fire from a graduate student in Case Weston in physics department. And I actually read her paper. It was completely nonsense. I just didn't know why Nature could have published that paper. But anyway, and there was the resident expert, the connoisseur of Jackson Pollock painting, was also happened to be in Case Weston. Her name is Alan Landolph. Okay? So she held her own press conference saying Richard Taylor was completely wrong. In her analysis, they were all authentic Jackson Pollock. So that made, there was, who was right? Who was, so it was science, well, there was quantitative stellometry versus counterportrait. And the two sides, neither side is willing to give in until, I would say it's about 5-6 years ago. The family finally decided to let a tiny piece of the canvas to be sprayed for spectral analysis. And a team of scientists actually analyzed that, I think at Harvard. And they realized that the paint used for those drip paintings were made after Pollock's death. So they were completely fake. So we're not, and this was actually a triumph of these quantitative, analysis. Okay. So I think I will. I wouldn't go to the last one. So I want to do a case study. So I decided to do a case study of these, stellometry analysis. And one of the things we focused on was a Chinese textbook, a Chinese book they're actually quite challenging because in English literature, in English text, you have these atoms. The atoms is just a word, okay? But in Chinese text, the atoms is more like a character, and this character is somewhere in between a letter like A, B, C, D, and a word. It's not quite a word because a character can have very different meanings, okay? But they're not also like just a letter. Okay? So it's somewhere in between. It poses a little bit of a challenge. But so we decide to analyze a particular work, literary work called. It's a book called The Dreams of the Red Chamber, and you can see this is the Chinese name here, and this is being translated. In fact, it's being translated into many different languages. So this is the English version. This is sort of the German version. Okay. This particular book is widely considered as the most brilliant literary piece in the history of Chinese literature. Okay, even today, okay, that opinion is still echoed by just about every literary scholar. Okay. And you can see they were made into movies, and they were made into fashions, So, and let me just give a little bit of history of this book. So the book was written by, the author is this guy, Cao Xueqing, CAO actually pronounced Cao in Chinese. Okay? So it was written in 1750s. And it was, as I say, it was widely acknowledged as the greatest literary work in the history of Chinese literature. And so remember, during that time, there were you don't have a lot of printing going on. Okay, so people write their work, handwritten them, then pass them on, and often these were copied also by hand. So the first hand-copied manuscript began to circulate in 1759, and it consists of 80 chapters. Right? So the printed version came about in 1791, but suddenly it got 120 chapters. Right? So there were some people were a little bit suspicious of this, and these two guys were scholars, Chen and Gao. Okay? So they suddenly had 40 new chapters, and they claimed that they were able to go around and found the rest of the book, and they put together basically. So they got the rest of the book from different sources. Okay, but not everybody bought it. In fact, most scholars sort of were very suspicious, and one of the leading scholars, Hu Shi, for instance, he simply claimed it was fraud. Okay, so it was not written by Cao. Instead, it was written by Gao, the last 40 chapters. Okay? Now, there are all kinds of claims from the connoisseurship point of view. The writing was inferior. The fate of the characters was inconsistent with what the original book foreshadowed. And so there was huge. I guess it was a big controversy, but actually this controversy itself had spawned a field in literary analysis in China. It's called the red duology. Okay? So red duology simply means, so this is this is incredible. So this red duology simply means this particular area of study for this book. In particular, people talk about the controversy. And what surprised me was when I look into this problem, there are very few analysis using mathematical tools. Okay? Was mainly based on emotion and connoisseurship, and some people just simply based on emotion. Okay? There were very few. There are some, but very few. And they were actually, when you look closely, they were actually either not so rigorous or flawed. And none of them use modern techniques such as machine learning theory to study this book. Okay? So I gave these were all the studies I could find, sort of more reputable ones, and they draw a different conclusion. For instance, this one is quite interesting. He was taking, I mean, of course, the GB2312 is an encoding system. So it's a big library of Chinese characters encoded in a certain way. Now, this was completely a modern contraption. Okay, you wouldn't have this until you have computers. Okay, but the book was written in the 18th century. So you may think it makes no sense. Okay, but he actually compared the characters used, used in the book, which are outside the modern encoding system. Okay? And he found that the original 80 chapter had far more characters outside the system than the last 40 chapters. In a way, it makes sense because it characterizes the sophistication of the author. Whether the author has a vast sort of knowledge of the language, he was comfortable using characters that were not comfortably used by others. So I thought it was a kind of interesting way to look at things. Okay? But I will not go into a lot of details here. And there are people saying it was, their analysis show it was not written by the same author, and then the others say, yeah, their analysis show it was written by the same author. Okay? And so we decided to actually. Oh, but by the way, the two studies we found supporting the one author hypothesis was really flawed. Okay, so we could pinpoint exactly where they made some mistakes. Anyway, so we decided to treat this using a different way of looking at things. Okay, so you have a book that is written. Suppose you suspect the book was written by two different authors. One author wrote the first, 80 chapter or whatever X number of chapters. The second author wrote the Y chapters. Okay, so and you don't know this. Maybe true, maybe not true. Okay, so what we decided to do is to chop off just a piece of the first few chapters, the first half, and a piece in the last half. And then we assume they are written by different authors. So because we now have two texts we think are written by different authors, we can perform the standard machine learning theory analysis to build a classifier to separate these. So basically, in the support vector machine or the machine learning tech, you have a bunch of points. Okay, so you have you have a bunch of points here. You have a bunch of points here. If you assume they're different, falling into different clusters, then what you do is you try to find like a hyperplane or a quadratic function. In this case, we just use hyperplane to separate them. And then if a new point comes along, okay, a new point comes along, and you plug in this hyperplane, which is a function. You say, okay, it's positive, then it's here. If it's negative, it's here. Okay. So if you've got a positive value, you say, okay, it has to be grouped into this group. Now, there are a lot of intermediate steps which I actually prepared slides for, but I don't think I will have time to talk about. The problem is the dimension typically are very high. Okay, so these data are lying in very, very high dimension. So you can always find a plane that separates them. So you have overfitting. So to guard against this particular problem, you actually have to use cross-validation to make sure, to randomization to make sure what you get here is what it should be. Okay? It's not a result of overfitting. Okay? So we did that. And if indeed the book is written by two different people, then there should be a sharp division in the data, so that at some point every sample is going to be up positive and the other side is negative. Okay, that's the goal. Okay, so so this is just some of the mathematical idea behind it. So I did exactly. And I'm not going to get into details here, but essentially this tells us how do we select the features, how do we build this classified in a robust way. Okay? Yeah, so I think I wouldn't have time to go over. It's Friday anyway, nobody wants to hear that. But just give you an idea that you have, when you take those data, they're in books, but we translate them into features. The features are maybe the frequency of certain words. Okay. Then you actually take a body of text and convert it into a point in a very high dimensional space. Then you try to build a classifier. That's the idea. Okay. So what are some of the features? Let me just talk a little bit about it. So typically, there are different ways you can do features. So what we did was we look at the so-called function words. These words that don't have context meaning. Okay, there are like prepositions, for instance. Okay, or in fact, if you just focus on function words, they don't actually work particularly well. So you really have to enlarge the pool. So we look at words, we look at combination of words. And then we actually manually eliminate certain some that have no context, have maybe related to the content of the book. Okay, so we kept only those that we believe have nothing to do with the content. Okay, so that's what we did, and that seemed to be other people are doing the similar things. Okay, so we built a very we map. So we actually take one chapter and compute the frequencies and the frequencies of certain phrases and the average sentence or the length of sentence, various features, and we put them into the high dimensional space, and then we build this classifier. So after that, we do all these randomization, and we got a robust. Pretty robust classifier, and this is what we found. Okay, forget about the one on the left. It just tells you, when you do the training, what kind of error you get for your for the training set. And you can see, so we took the first 30 chapter, and we took the first several chapters. I forgot exactly, maybe 60 chapters. Actually, we didn't have to use this many chapters. Okay, so you could do it with only 30 chapters as your training set. Okay? Now you can see. So this is under no assumption that the book should have a dividing aid, should have a suspected dividing aid. We didn't know. We just plug in, and you can see right at chapter 80 there is a big division. Okay, so everything above. Everything before 80 was positive, was in one class. Okay? Everything after was in the other class. So clearly, these two, the beginning and the end, sort of shows that they are not having the same style. Okay? And it's very conclusive from this point of view that since we didn't know our information analysis does not include this chapter 80. It was it's sort of like the OJ's blood was found in the glove. If he wasn't a suspect, then you can say the DNA may have a, but he was all the suspect, and then they found a glove with his DNA on, and that just made it even more convincing. Okay. So this was actually what happened, and so it was pretty strong, almost very hard, undeniably, that these last 40 chapters were written in a different style than the first 80 chapters. Okay? The only problem is here you have chapter 67, which was also below. But when you do mathematical analysis, this kind of thing always will happen. You cannot get 100%. Right? So it just will happen that you don't get 100%. And here we sort of accept the fact. We run many, many different tests. You still get this guy below. So we accepted that as an outlier of the inherent in all sort of quantitative analysis, until one day I gave for these radiology a more closer look. I actually went to the to a source to tell us what are the main problems, main questions people care about in radiology. And guess what? One of the questions was, is chapter 67 written by Tom? We didn't know anything about it, okay? So, I mean, this actually provides pretty strong evidence that this may not be written by him. So we also did the same, exactly the same analysis for the first 80 chapter. You can see there's no clear demarcation, okay? And we did for the last 80, and again, this is more like behaves slightly differently. It's more like a gradual, sort of change. But we also work on the 3 other classic novels in China, along with The Dream of Red Chamber. That these are viewed as sort of the 4 classic Chinese novels, and none of them exhibit anything like The Dream of Red Chamber. So it's actually pretty convincing evidence that it's not written by the same people. Just out of curiosity, okay, so I was talking to Doug yesterday. Michael Crichton, how many of you actually read Michael Crichton's books? A lot of you. So his last book was his Micro, okay? And unfortunately he died before the book was finished. So the publisher really wanted to finish this, to have this book. So they commissioned Richard Preston, who wrote the Hawthorne, okay, to finish the book. And Richard Preston apparently, and I mean, what I read later was he was very nervous about doing this. And, so eventually he agreed. He thought it was a challenge he was willing to take on. So he finished the book. I actually did read the book. And so, in fact, it was interesting to see, well, where did he actually take over? Okay? I was just the day before yesterday, I was talking to a friend of mine. I mentioned this. He's like, oh yeah, I read the Micro. It was clear. This guy, Richard Preston, was so different from Micro. I could tell you, you don't need mathematics to tell you exactly where this new thing began. I said, well, where? Where did you? He said, I actually paid attention. I knew exactly where. So I said, where? He said it was somewhere like after the first half, around like 2/3 of the way. Okay. I told him he was wrong. Okay. Actually, so we did exactly the same analysis, and you could see actually here there is more or less around here. Okay? And this is just a sample. Sample is like we take like a couple of thousand words as one sample. Okay? So it roughly starts here. And if you go back to the book, it corresponds to about 1/3 of the way. Okay? So I told him he was wrong. If he was reading the book backwards, he would be right. But he wasn't. And he didn't believe me. Then I told him, later on, after we did this, we actually found an interview of Richard Preston with New York Times Book Review or something. And he actually did say that he started about 1/3 of the way. Okay, so now I want to use the remaining time to quickly go over some other controversies. Okay? So I mentioned a few. The J.K. Rowling was one of them. So out of curiosity, we decided to use our method to see how well we can tell the book was, how well these cuckoo's calling matched J.K. Rowling. And for that, we use a different method. It's called one versus the rest. It's a well-known technique in machine learning. So basically, but I don't believe these other guys were actually used as SO2, which was kind of surprising. So basically, now you don't have just two books, two classes. You have several books. Okay. So in the case of Sunday Times, they actually sent 4 authors to the scientists try to figure out. So you will have 4 classes. Okay? So in this case, what this particular method called one versus regress is, instead of considering actually 4 classes, you still consider 2 classes. So let's say you have 4 different classes you want to consider. Okay? Now, instead of building a few classifiers to detect these 4 classes, you actually assume there are only 2 classes. So what you do is you take one book, call this one class, and put the rest in another class. Then you build a classifier. Okay? And you do this 4 times. Okay? So for each book, you build, for each author, you build a classifier if you have 4 authors, for instance. Okay? Then you take a voting system. So let's say another book came along, and you feed it into these 4 different classifiers and see which one gives you the largest value. Okay? And then the one that gives you the largest value is a vote. Okay? So it just means it is closest to that. Okay? So we did that, and so just to see how, what kind of results we are able to obtain. So we actually did J.K. Rowling. So we took a book by J.K. Rowling. Okay? It's called Casual Vacancy. This was the first non-Harry Potter book. And we take another P.D. James for the privatization. So we run through this, just 2 classes. We run through Cuckoo's Calling. You can see we cut Cuckoo's Calling into 72 samples, like roughly every 1,000 or 2,000, every 1,500 words or so. Okay, so you can see 72 of the 72 samples are being voted to J.K. Rowling. Okay? None is being voted to P.D. James. That just means this book, comparing these 2, is much closer to this. Okay, and then we take a known J.K. Rowling book. So this is Harry Potter. Okay. And we got something like this. Okay, 92 of them have been voted to J.K. to Casual Vacancy, and only 8 of them goes to P.D. James. And when we take a P.D. James book, well, it's overwhelmingly P.D. James. So at least in this case, it's pretty overwhelmingly robust. Okay? So we did. So then we say, okay, let's take the same 4 authors given by Sunday Times, and let's do the same thing, okay, for these. So we pick, again, the Casual Vacancy. Okay. So Cuckoo's Calling, 65 out of 72 is being voted into J.K. Rowling. And you have a few sporadic ones here. And then we took the Harry Potter. Well, actually, surprisingly, it didn't perform as well. Okay? But still, it's pretty overwhelming. Okay? And maybe that's because of the content, but or the intended audience. One is a children's book, the other was for adults. And we took a P.D. James book, Tom's Hamburger. And you could see that overwhelmingly they're voted into P.D. James. And same thing with, this is Ruth Rendell. You can see overwhelmingly it's being voted there. And this is Val McDermott. And you can see every one of them is being voted to. So it turned out, in fact, we performed this just by randomly pick some books. Or not random, sort of random. It's not totally random because a lot of books I don't have. I mean, these are the books I do have. And and you can perform, Harry Potter. You see same phenomena, although randomly sometimes you do have a few exceptions, like This one is this is Agatha Christie, for instance, a book, compare. Well, yeah, it is mostly her, but you also have here. But the sample size is very small. So the story here is, if I just even by randomly pick some book, this method seemed to be really robust. Okay, so we didn't have any. It was more robust than I thought, and which was actually quite surprising because most of the statements by others in the field is the conclusive evidence is very, very hard to obtain. Well, I'm not saying these are conclusive, but they're pretty overwhelming in some way. Okay? And so we just decided to say maybe if we increase the number of trainings, so instead of using just one book as we did previously, so let's do 2 books. Okay? We each put 2 books there. Well, one problem is I no longer have more. I only have 2 books for Ruth Randolph, okay, and maybe only 2 for Victor. Okay, so anyway, so but you can see now the results is even more impressive. Okay? There is although very little doubt here. Okay, so of course, if Sunday Time actually asked me, whether this was written J.K., I probably would have made a stronger statement, say, yeah, I have no doubt this was written by J.K. Rowling. Okay. But anyway, so I want to move on to another controversy. It wasn't as big a controversy as some other, but there was lingering doubt that To Kill a Mockingbird, of course, one of the great literary piece in 20th century. It was written by Harper Lee, but there were lingering suspicion that she actually did not write the book. The reason, the suspicion was the following: well, it was such a good book, and she never wrote anything else before or after, and she refused to give any interviews about this book. So there was actually. It was always in the back of people's mind. Maybe it wasn't written by her. And in fact, she was a really good friend of Truman Capote. So they were hanging out together since in the 1930s in Alabama. So they were really good friends. And so the suspicion was actually it was written by Truman Capote. Okay. So Truman Capote, of course, he has, so we took Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and we decided to build the same kind of classifier. Actually, we now have even 5 people in training, so this is a bit more than just 3 or 4. Usually, the more people you put up here, the less reliable things become. Okay, so we tested maybe all the way to 8 people. It still gives pretty good result, but once you go beyond that, it's the reliability start to deteriorate. So we again we pick Norman Mailer's Execution of Some, and we put McDermott, and there's also John Buren had the Midnight Garden Group of Evil. Douglas Preston, who was actually the brother of Richard Preston, wrote this book called The Monster of Florence. It was all these have share similarity with In Cold Blood. So we run through the same, and you could see that that's what you get. Okay. So for To Kill a Mockingbird, it doesn't really stick to any one of them. It was sort of evenly spread it out, and it essentially says that. It essentially debunk, at least provide evidence that this was not written by Truman Capote, at least from this analysis. So, but you may want to say, okay, what about, what if you take another book of Truman Capote, how well would that do? And in fact, we did. We did try a couple other books. This is The Other Voices, I think, by Truman Capote. And you can see there are very overwhelming, very much. And there was another book we tried that was the same way. It was overwhelmingly classified to Truman Capote. And we also took a book from Norman Mailer, his own book, and you could also see this one is much larger than anything else. Remember here, we also only use one book. So if we had a chance, we will run these with more books, I think it will be even more overwhelming. Okay. So essentially, they're all now. In fact, there are strong evidence to say that Harper Lee did write this her own book. Even Truman Capote repeatedly said that he wished he had written the book. Okay. But people seem to be willing to ignore all these evidences. And so I hope this will be one more evidence we can put this behind. Interestingly, To Kill a Mockingbird, actually, you have 15 out of 49. It turned out that the story was she actually helped Truman Capote to write in cold. Okay, finally, I want to go to the latest controversy, which has political implications. You've probably seen that on Fox News. Okay, so there was a conspiracy theory. This former left-wing radical Bill Ayers claimed he made repeated claims that he wrote the book Obama's autobiography, Dreams from My Father, okay? And it was covered by right-wing news media outlets and even some more or less respectable media outlets. And Fox News, in fact, there were a few blogs, and you will see. So that got a bunch of even scholars into looking at this particular. For instance, Patrick Juala actually did look into this, and what he said was he felt there were a lot of similarities between Dreams from My Father from Bill Ayers he did not say conclusively that Bill Ayers actually wrote it, but he actually claimed. I think there was some evidence of showing stemmetric similarity. Okay, so we decided to look into this using our method. It just turned out Bill Ayers actually wrote a bunch of other books. And Obama also wrote a book called Audacity Hope, and the claim was Audacity Hope was unlikely to be written by Obama because by that time he actually had a bunch of ghostwriters writing for him, so it might not be written by him. So we didn't actually treat this as his book. Okay? So we analyzed, we used one of Bill Ayers' book, and this other book called Confessions. I actually bought two of them on Amazon and decided to analyze them. Well, it turned out the Dreams from My Father has very little correlation to what Bill Ayers wrote. Okay. And in fact, we performed analysis with other books here, okay? And every one of them tells the same story. This one was actually giving you like a 10 out of 74 samples of devoted to Ayers. Most of the others was, one of them was 0 out of 74. The other was like 5 out of 74. So it was almost certain that Bill Ayers lied about it, that he did not have a hand on this. He may have read the book and made some comments about it, but that was about it. And you can see, we also included, just randomly picked Barbara Tuchman's book, and you see from another book by Tuchman would have 78 out of 80. So the surprising thing is, actually, it turned out Obama actually did write Audacity Hope, at least had a big hand on this. Okay? And of course, if you look at Bill Ayers, his own book, it was all voted to Bill Ayers, and nothing else, almost nothing else. I think that's my last slide. Thank you. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah?
So you said it gets less reliable as you add more test cases. So in that case, does doing pairwise testing give you much better results?
Actually, this is a very good question. We tried pairwise not just for this, but for other type of classification. It turned out you would think, so pairwise means you have these 4 books. Let's divide a pairwise context. Okay, so 4 books, pick 2 pairs, any pair, and build a classifier. Then you start to do this pairwise comparison to. You would think that this was more reliable because when you group the rest of them together, they are very inhomogeneous. They may not have a style to share at all. Okay, but it turned out which surprised me was the one versus rest always work better than pairwise. And so if you increase the number of training sets, okay, in one time, then it's, of course it's going to deteriorate, but it's going to deteriorate in the same way because now suddenly you have, if you have 10, then you will have to build 55 classifiers. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you given any thought to how authors compare the past with themselves in the present?
Yeah, we actually also tried. We actually, the surprising thing was from our perspective, our study was it's actually quite consistent. And the authors don't seem to change as much from time to time. A lot of these books took a long time, especially the Dreams of Red Chamber. It actually took quite many years to complete. Okay? But we did not seem to see a particular sort of change in style from our point of view. And if you look at like a Truman Capote, this one was written in 70 something. I forgot exactly what this one was written, but there was no. We didn't have any problem, voting one to the other. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned words, function words like prepositions
Yeah.
as one crude way of testing. And then you said something about combinations of words.
Yeah.
Can you give a few examples of?
Well, so here actually I can tell you exactly what we did. Okay. So we took in the Chinese text. Okay, we take characters, but we also take combination of characters. In something like a Juala would call n-gram, it just means basically n characters string, n letters string together, which doesn't even bother with meaning of those. Okay, so for our test here, we took the 300 most commonly used words in the book. Then we took like 100 or something of the most commonly used 2-word combinations. And then when you compare this with the other book, you actually typically have a large intersection. Okay? So we sort of throw out those that don't intersect. And then we still we would go one quick look, basically to eliminate words that are clearly related to the content. That's how we do. So we don't use function words anymore. In fact, as I said, there was even a survey. There was probably authoritative survey article on literary stoichiometry on these authorship. The author claimed that the use of most commonly used words and sort of removing some obvious ones that you don't want to be in is far more effective than just taking the fixed set of function words, which is our expectation. It's our experience. Because if we just take the function word, they don't have as much discriminating power.
On one of the tables, a book called Radius in the left-hand column.
Okay, so hold on. Which one?
That one right there. I noticed that book got a majority of votes to an author who wasn't the author of that book.
Which one?
On the, it says it's by Alexander McCall Smith.
Oh, Alexander McCall Smith. Yeah, okay.
And the majority of the votes there are for Truman.
Yeah, no, okay. This is I see. Yeah, yes, you're right. This is a mistake. This was, yeah,
Okay.
my student, yeah, this was a mistake. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah. Good call. You passed the final exam.
Well, that's obviously a good moment to stop, so let's
Right.
thank the speaker again.